The summer heat hung heavy over Moscow that June afternoon in 1946, turning the Kremlin stone corridors into furnaces of still air. Marshal Georgy Zhukov stood in the antechamber outside Stalin's war room, his dress uniform immaculate, his medals gleaming in the dim light filtering through narrow windows. He had been summoned to the Supreme Soviet's inner sanctum, and he knew with cold certainty what awaited him inside. The war had been over for 13 months. Berlin had fallen, Hitler was dead, and the Soviet Union stood triumphant, though bleeding from wounds that would take a generation to heal. Zhukov had commanded the final assault on Berlin, had personally overseen the victory parade in Red Square while riding a white stallion, had become the most celebrated military commander in Soviet history, perhaps in Russian history stretching back to Suvorov. 20 million Soviet citizens had died. Entire cities lay in ruins, but the hammer and sickle flew over the Reichstag. And that, he understood, was precisely the problem. Through the heavy oak door, he could hear muffled voices. Stalin's distinctive Georgian accent, clipped and measured. Molotov's bureaucratic drone, Berry's oily insinuations. They were preparing the theater, arranging the set pieces for his humiliation. The accusations were absurd, that he had looted German treasures for personal gain, that he sought Bonapartist power, that he had inflated his own military genius at the expense of Stalin's wise leadership. But the absurdity of the charges was irrelevant. This was about power, about a dictator who could not tolerate any figure whose fame might eclipse his own. An aide emerged, a nervous young lieutenant whose face betrayed his awareness that he stood at the threshold of dangerous history. "Comrade Marshal," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "the General Secretary will see you now. You are to enter and stand before the Council for formal review of charges brought against you by the main military council." Zhukov looked at the open door, at the dim room beyond where Stalin and his creatures waited. He thought of all the rooms he had entered during 6 years of war, command bunkers under artillery fire, captured German headquarters still warm with the presence of fleeing enemies, the Reichstag itself with its walls covered in Cyrillic graffiti proclaiming victory. He had never hesitated at any threshold, had never felt fear before entering any space, no matter how dangerous. But this was different. This wasn't combat. This was ritual humiliation, choreographed betrayal, the kind of political theater at which Stalin excelled. To enter that room would be to participate in his own degradation, to validate the lies that would be used to destroy everything he had built, to give Stalin's paranoia the legitimacy of a formal proceeding. The other marshals would be watching, the officer corps would hear every detail, and the message would be unmistakable. No one, no matter how great their service, stood beyond Stalin's reach. Zhukov made his decision. "Tell the General Secretary," he said, quietly, his voice devoid of emotion, "that Marshal Zhukov respectfully declines to attend this proceeding. I will await reassignment orders at my quarters. Whatever judgment the party renders, I will accept, but I will not participate in theater." The lieutenant's face went white. "Comrade Marshal, you cannot refuse a direct summons from—" "I just have. Deliver my message." What the historical record would later obscure, what Soviet historians would never acknowledge, and what Western scholars would piece together only decades later from fragmentary testimonies and declassified KGB files, was that in this moment, Zhukov made a choice that changed the calculus of Stalin's purge. By refusing to enter, by denying Stalin the spectacle of his humiliation, he forced the dictator to choose between making Zhukov a martyr through immediate arrest or settling for the lesser victory of exile and demotion. Stalin's genius had always been in making his victims complicit in their own destruction, in forcing them to confess, to grovel, to validate the charges against them. Zhukov's refusal disrupted that machinery. The tension between these two men embodied something far deeper than personal rivalry. It represented the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Soviet state, between the Red Army that had saved the nation and the party apparatus that claimed credit for the victory. Zhukov represented military professionalism, merit earned through blood and competence. Stalin represented political power maintained through terror and the systematic destruction of any potential rival. Zhukov had been born in 1896 in Strelkovka, a village so small it appeared on no maps, the son of a cobbler. He had risen through ability alone, commanding armies when he was barely 40, orchestrating the defense of Moscow when the German panzers could see the Kremlin spires, planning the operations that crushed Army Group Center and drove to Berlin. He believed in the army as an institution, in the professional officer corps, in the idea that military effectiveness required autonomy from political interference. Stalin, born Iosif Zhugashvili in Georgia in 1878, the son of a violent alcoholic shoemaker and a washerwoman, had climbed to power through cunning, ruthlessness, and an instinctive understanding that in revolutionary politics, survival required the systematic elimination of anyone who might pose a threat. He had spent the 1930s purging the military of anyone with initiative or independence, executing 90% of the general staff in 1937, crippling the Red Army just as war approached. The disaster of 1941, when German forces nearly destroyed the Soviet Union in the first 6 months, had forced Stalin to allow military professionals like Zhukov the freedom to fight effectively. But now, with victory won, he intended to reassert control, to ensure that no general could ever become powerful enough to challenge party supremacy. But in that moment, standing in the overheated antechamber, these grand ideological conflicts condensed into something far more primal and human. It became about respect, about whether Zhukov would accept being treated as a criminal after saving the nation, about whether survival required the complete abandonment of dignity. He had made his choice. Let Stalin do what he would. The lieutenant disappeared into the war room. Zhukov could hear the sudden silence, then Stalin's voice, low and dangerous, asking questions. More silence. Then footsteps. He expected NKVD guards to emerge, to arrest him on the spot, to drag him to the Lubyanka's basement cells where so many others had vanished. Instead, the door remained closed. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. Finally, the lieutenant returned, his hands trembling slightly as he held out a sealed envelope. "The General Secretary has issued your reassignment orders, Comrade Marshal. You are to assume command of the Odessa Military District, effective immediately. You are dismissed from this meeting." Zhukov took the envelope without opening it. Odessa. A backwater command, a military graveyard, as far from Moscow and power as Stalin could send him without resorting to arrest. But it was exile, not execution. Humiliation, not destruction. He had gambled that Stalin would prefer to diminish him gradually rather than create a martyr, and he had been right. For now. But what none of them knew, what would only emerge decades later through the testimony of a dying man to his grandson and the careful research of Soviet historians after the archives began opening in the 1990s, was that at that precise moment someone else was watching this drama unfold, recording every detail, and that his observations would set in motion consequences that none of the principals could have imagined. His name was Captain Viktor Abakumov, though that was not the name he had been born with. He had been born Viktor Davidovich Rosenberg in Minsk in 1919, the son of a Jewish watchmaker and a Russian schoolteacher. His father had been killed in a pogrom in 1921 when White Army remnants had swept through their neighborhood. His mother had remarried in 1923 to a party official named Pyotr Abakumov, who had adopted Viktor and given him a name that wouldn't mark him as Jewish in an increasingly anti-Semitic state. Viktor had joined the NKVD in 1937, during the height of the Great Terror, because it had seemed like the safest place to be. If you were interrogating others, you were less likely to be interrogated yourself. He had a gift for reading people,
for detecting the small tells that indicated deception or fear, and his superiors had noticed. By 1941, he had been transferred to SMERSH, the military counterintelligence service, where he had spent the war hunting German spies and Soviet defectors. But the war had changed him. He had seen too much: the mass graves, the casual brutality, the way innocent people could be destroyed by a misplaced word or an anonymous denunciation. He had participated in interrogations that he knew were based on fabricated evidence, had filed reports condemning men he believed to be innocent, and had slowly come to understand that the system he served was not protecting the revolution, but devouring it. By 1946, he had been assigned to Beria's personal staff, tasked with surveillance of senior military commanders. On this June afternoon, he was stationed in a hidden observation post adjacent to Stalin's war room, recording the meeting for Beria's files. The observation post was one of many throughout the Kremlin, small rooms concealed behind walls and hidden by false panels, from which NKVD officers could watch and listen to every important meeting, every private conversation.
Victor watched through a concealed viewing slit as Zhukov stood in the antechamber, watched the marshal's face as he received the summons, watched him make his refusal. He saw Stalin's reaction when the lieutenant delivered Zhukov's message, the tightening around the dictator's eyes, the slight reddening of his face, the way his pipe hand clenched. He heard Stalin's muttered cursing in Georgian, heard Beria suggest immediate arrest, heard Molotov argue for caution. And he understood something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Zhukov's refusal had saved him. By denying Stalin the spectacle, by forcing the dictator to either arrest a national hero publicly or accept a compromise, Zhukov had created a situation where Stalin's paranoia was checked by his political calculation. If Zhukov had entered, had stood before the council, Stalin could have orchestrated a complete humiliation, extracted a confession, broken him psychologically. The arrest and execution would have followed within months, presented as the just punishment of a confessed traitor. But Zhukov hadn't entered, and Stalin, after a tense 15 minutes of debate, had chosen exile over martyrdom. Victor recorded all of this in his report, but he also did something else, something that could have gotten him executed if discovered. He made a second copy of his observations, a private record that he hid in his quarters. He had begun to understand that someday, when Stalin was dead, when this madness ended, someone would need to document what had really happened, who had resisted, who had maintained dignity in the face of terror. He was wrong about the timing. He wouldn't live to see Stalin's death. But what none of them knew, including Victor, was that there was another player in this drama, someone whose existence remained buried even deeper in the classified archives, someone whose desperate attempt to warn Zhukov would intersect with Victor's observations in ways that would reshape Soviet military politics for a generation. Her name was Major Svetlana Mikhailovna Ivanova, and officially, she too did not exist. Svetlana had been born in 1917 in St. Petersburg, then called Petrograd, the daughter of a Bolshevik revolutionary who had fought in the October Revolution. Her father, Mikhail Ivanov, had been a true believer, one of Lenin's early followers, a man who had genuinely believed that the revolution would create a workers' paradise. He had been arrested in 1934 during the early purges, accused of Trotskyist deviation. Svetlana had been 14 when they took him. She never saw him again. Her mother had died of typhus in 1919, so Svetlana had been raised by her father's sister, a schoolteacher who had somehow managed to avoid arrest despite her father's fate. She had been brilliant, graduating from Moscow State University in 1938 with degrees in mathematics and German. The NKVD had recruited her immediately, recognizing her potential for intelligence work. By 1945, she had been assigned to GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence, working in the German section, analyzing captured Wehrmacht documents and interrogating German prisoners. She had spent months in Berlin after the city fell, sorting through German military records, identifying officers who might provide useful intelligence. It was during this work that she had stumbled onto something that had terrified her. She had found evidence in captured German documents of a systematic Soviet operation during 1943-1944 to fabricate trophy looting charges against successful Soviet generals.
The documents included testimony from German witnesses who had been coerced by NKVD officers to provide false statements about Soviet generals stealing artwork and valuables. The obvious implication was that Stalin was preparing to purge the military leadership even before the war ended, gathering pretexts for future arrests. Svetlana had recognized Zhukov's name in several of these fabricated reports. She understood immediately what it meant. The most celebrated general in Soviet history, the man who had saved Moscow and taken Berlin, was being set up for destruction. She had to warn him. But warning a marshal was not simple for a major in military intelligence. She couldn't approach him directly. That would be noticed, reported, investigated. She couldn't send a letter. All mail to senior commanders was screened by NKVD censors. She couldn't use official channels. Those channels were controlled by the very people fabricating the evidence. She needed an intermediary, someone with access to Zhukov, someone she could trust. She thought she had found one. Colonel Andrei Volkov, one of Zhukov's staff officers, had been a university classmate of her cousin. She had arranged a meeting in late May 1946 in a Moscow cafe, ostensibly to discuss routine intelligence matters. She had brought with her a folder containing photocopies of some of the German documents, carefully selected to avoid revealing her broader discovery. She had intended to pass them to Volkov with a quiet warning about the dangers Zhukov faced. She never got the chance. Volkov had been arrested 2 days before their scheduled meeting, charged with espionage. Whether his arrest was connected to her attempt to contact him, whether someone was watching, whether it simply was bad timing, she would never know. But she understood that she was now in terrible danger. If Volkov was interrogated, if he mentioned her approach, if the NKVD connected her to the missing German documents, her life was over.
She had one remaining option, desperate and dangerous. She would go directly to the Kremlin, would request an emergency meeting with Zhukov's office, would deliver her warning in person. It was almost certainly suicidal. But she had spent too many years watching innocent people destroyed to remain silent when she could prevent one more tragedy. On June 4, 1946, the same day Zhukov was summoned to Stalin's war room, Svetlana had taken a tram across Moscow to the Kremlin, carrying her folder of documents hidden in a shopping bag beneath a loaf of bread and some vegetables. She had rehearsed her approach 100 times. She would request to speak with someone on Zhukov's staff about urgent intelligence matters related to German prisoner interrogations. Once inside, she would find a way to deliver her warning. She never made it past the outer checkpoint. The NKVD guard who examined her papers had paused, consulted a list, then politely but firmly detained her. She was wanted for questioning in connection with an ongoing security investigation. She would need to come with them. She had been taken to a holding cell in the Kremlin's basement, ironically only a few hundred meters from where Zhukov was refusing to enter Stalin's war room. She sat on a metal bench, her shopping bag confiscated, knowing that within hours, perhaps minutes, interrogators would begin asking questions she could not answer without condemning herself. The documents would be found, her theft would be discovered, and then would come the basement cells of Lubyanka, the interrogations, the confession, the bullet. But what none of them knew, not Svetlana sitting in her cell, not Zhukov standing in the antechamber, not Viktor Abakumov watching from his hidden post, was that there was one more player in this drama, someone whose observations of these intersecting crises would carry implications that reached far beyond Stalin's paranoia or Soviet internal politics. His name was Captain James Forrester, and he was a U.S. Army intelligence officer attached to the American liaison mission in Moscow. Forrester had been born in 1918 in Boston, the son of an Irish immigrant dock worker and an Italian-American seamstress. He had grown up in the North End, speaking Italian at home and English on the streets, learning early to navigate between different worlds, different languages, different communities. He had joined the Army in 1941, and his language skills had gotten him assigned to military intelligence. By 1943, he was in North Africa, interrogating Italian prisoners. By 1944, he was in France, working with resistance networks. By 1945, he was in Germany, helping to establish the occupation administration. And by 1946, he had been assigned to Moscow, to the small American military mission that was supposed to coordinate with Soviet forces on occupation matters, but was really engaged in intelligence gathering about Soviet military capabilities and intentions. Forrester had been at the Kremlin that June afternoon for a routine meeting about displaced persons in the Soviet occupation zone, a tedious bureaucratic matter that had required him to spend 3 hours in a waiting room while Soviet officials shuffled papers and made him wait, the standard treatment for Western liaison officers in Moscow. It was pure harassment disguised as procedure, designed to remind him that he was tolerated, not welcomed. He had noticed the unusual activity in the Kremlin corridors that afternoon, the clusters of NKVD guards, the nervous aides hurrying past, the sense that something significant was happening just out of sight. His Russian was fluent enough to catch fragments of whispered conversations, and what he heard had intrigued him. The marshal has refused, Stalin is furious, Beria wants arrest, political implications. He had cultivated over the past 6 months a network of minor contacts, clerks, drivers, guards, people on the periphery of power who saw things but were rarely asked what they knew. One of these contacts, a records clerk named Dmitri, whom Forrester had befriended by trading American cigarettes for gossip, had been on duty that day. Forrester had managed a brief conversation with him during a bathroom break. "Something is happening with Zhukov," Dmitri had whispered, glancing nervously down the corridor. He was summoned to meet Stalin, but he refused to enter the war room. They say Stalin wanted to humiliate him for Bonapartism, but Zhukov wouldn't participate. Now they are debating what to do. Forrester had felt his pulse quicken. This was significant. Zhukov was a towering figure, the Soviet Union's most celebrated military commander. If Stalin was moving against him, it suggested a major purge of the military leadership might be coming, a repeat of the 1937 disaster that had nearly cost the Soviets the war. The implications for American policy were enormous. He had also noticed the young woman being detained at the checkpoint, had seen the NKVD guards examining papers, had watched her being led away to the basement cells. He had caught only a glimpse of her face, but he had seen enough. The resignation, the fear, the knowledge of what awaited her. He had wanted to intervene, but he knew that any attempt to help a Soviet citizen would only make things worse for her and would get him expelled from the country.
That evening, back at the American compound, Forrester had written a detailed intelligence report. He described Zhukov's refusal to meet Stalin, the rumors of impending purges, the tension he had observed in the Kremlin. He noted the professional competence of the Soviet military contrasted with the evident paranoia of the political leadership. And he made a prediction that would prove remarkably prescient. The Soviet Union had won the war, but Stalin's paranoia might cost them the peace. The report went through normal intelligence channels, eventually reaching the Pentagon and the State Department. It became one of thousands of reports analyzing Soviet internal politics in the uncertain months after the war. It helped shape the emerging understanding that the Soviet Union, despite its military might, was fundamentally unstable, that Stalin's paranoia created vulnerabilities that could be exploited, that the Soviet system might contain the seeds of its own destruction. But what Forrester never knew, what would remain classified in American intelligence files until the 1990s, was that his report had intersected with other intelligence streams in ways that would influence early Cold War strategy. His observation about Stalin purging successful generals had been combined with signals intelligence showing increased NKVD activity against military officers, with defector testimonies about morale problems in the Red Army, with economic intelligence showing the devastating cost of the war on Soviet industrial capacity. Together, these pieces had helped convince American planners that the Soviet Union, despite its apparent strength, could be contained through economic and political pressure, that military confrontation was unnecessary because the Soviet system would eventually collapse under its own contradictions. It was the birth of the containment doctrine, though Forrester's small contribution would never be acknowledged. Forrester would remain in Moscow until 1948, when the deteriorating relationship between the superpowers made the liaison mission untenable. He would return to the United States, work for the CIA during the 1950s, retire in 1968, and die in 1994 at his home in Virginia, having spent most of his career analyzing Soviet military affairs. In his final years, after the Soviet archives began opening, he would read accounts of Zhukov's 1946 demotion and recognize the incident he had witnessed. He would write a private memoir about his Moscow years, never published, noting in one passage, "I wonder about that young woman I saw being arrested that day in the Kremlin. Who was she? What had she done? Did she survive?" History records Zhukov's refusal, but it forgets the hundreds of smaller players whose fates intersected with his in ways that none of them understood. Svetlana Mikhailovna Ivanova did not survive. She was interrogated for 3 days in Lubyanka, where NKVD officers discovered the missing German documents, extracted through methods that need not be detailed, a confession that she had planned to provide intelligence to Western agents. The confession was false. She had never intended to contact Western intelligence, but false confessions were the currency of Stalin's terror. She was executed on June 12, 1946, 8 days after Zhukov refused to enter Stalin's war room, shot in a basement cell and buried in an unmarked mass grave at Butovo outside Moscow. Her file was sealed, her name struck from all records, her very existence erased from official history. Her aunt, who had raised her, received no notification, only a letter months later stating that Svetlana had been sentenced to 10 years imprisonment without right of correspondence, the standard euphemism for execution. The aunt died in 1951, never knowing that her niece had been dead for 5 years, never understanding what crime could have warranted such punishment. The document Svetlana had tried to deliver to Zhukov, the evidence of fabricated trophy-looting charges, were destroyed, but the charges themselves remained in place, waiting for the right moment to be deployed. Stalin would use them against Zhukov in 1948, demoting him even further, stripping away his remaining authority, reducing him to a series of meaningless administrative positions until Stalin's death in 1953 finally freed him to return to prominence. Viktor Abakumov's fate was equally grim, though it took longer to unfold. His secret records, his private documentation of Zhukov's refusal and Stalin's reaction remained hidden in his quarters for 6 years. He continued his work for Beria, continued his surveillance of military and party officials, continued to record observations that he hoped would someday serve as testimony to what had really happened. But in 1952, during Stalin's final paroxysm of paranoia, Beria himself fell under suspicion. And when Beria fell, his subordinates fell with him. Viktor was arrested in November 1952, charged with participation in a non-existent doctor's plot to assassinate Soviet leaders. During the search of his quarters, NKVD investigators found his hidden records. He was tortured for information about his conspiracy, though there was no conspiracy to reveal. He was told that his records proved that he had been gathering intelligence for foreign powers, though the records contained nothing but observations about internal Soviet politics. He was shown confessions from other arrested doctors and officials, all fabricated, all implicating him in plots that had never existed. That evening, back at the American compound, Forrester had written a detailed intelligence report. He described Zhukov's refusal to meet Stalin, the rumors of impending purges, the tension he had observed in the Kremlin. He noted the professional competence of the Soviet military contrasted with the evident paranoia of the political leadership. And he made a prediction that would prove remarkably prescient. The Soviet Union had won the war, but Stalin's paranoia might cost them the peace. The report went through normal intelligence channels, eventually reaching the Pentagon and the State Department. It became one of thousands of reports analyzing Soviet internal politics in the uncertain months after the war. It helped shape the emerging understanding that the Soviet Union, despite its military might, was fundamentally unstable, that Stalin's paranoia created vulnerabilities that could be exploited, that the Soviet system might contain the seeds of its own destruction. But what Forrester never knew, what would remain classified in American intelligence files until the 1990s, was that his report had intersected with other intelligence streams in ways that would influence early Cold War strategy. His observation about Stalin purging successful generals had been combined with signals intelligence showing increased NKVD activity against military officers, with defector testimonies about morale problems in the Red Army, with economic intelligence showing the devastating cost of the war on Soviet industrial capacity. Together, these pieces had helped convince American planners that the Soviet Union, despite its apparent strength, could be contained through economic and political pressure, that military confrontation was unnecessary because the Soviet system would eventually collapse under its own contradictions. It was the birth of the containment doctrine, though Forrester's small contribution would never be acknowledged. Forrester would remain in Moscow until 1948, when the deteriorating relationship between the superpowers made the liaison mission untenable. He would return to the United States, work for the CIA during the 1950s, retire in 1968, and die in 1994 at his home in Virginia, having spent most of his career analyzing Soviet military affairs. In his final years, after the Soviet archives began opening, he would read accounts of Zhukov's 1946 demotion and recognize the incident he had witnessed. He would write a private memoir about his Moscow years, never published, noting in one passage, "I wonder about that young woman I saw being arrested that day in the Kremlin. Who was she? What had she done? Did she survive?" History records Zhukov's refusal, but it forgets the hundreds of smaller players whose fates intersected with his in ways that none of them understood. Svetlana Mikhailovna Ivanova did not survive. She was interrogated for 3 days in Lubyanka, where NKVD officers discovered the missing German documents, extracted through methods that need not be detailed, a confession that she had planned to provide intelligence to Western agents. The confession was false. She had never intended to contact Western intelligence, but false confessions were the currency of Stalin's terror. She was executed on June 12, 1946, 8 days after Zhukov refused to enter Stalin's war room, shot in a basement cell and buried in an unmarked mass grave at Butovo outside Moscow. Her file was sealed, her name struck from all records, her very existence erased from official history. Her aunt, who had raised her, received no notification, only a letter months later stating that Svetlana had been sentenced to 10 years imprisonment without right of correspondence, the standard euphemism for execution. The aunt died in 1951, never knowing that her niece had been dead for 5 years, never understanding what crime could have warranted such punishment. The document Svetlana had tried to deliver to Zhukov, the evidence of fabricated trophy looting charges, were destroyed, but the charges themselves remained in place, waiting for the right moment to be deployed. Stalin would use them against Zhukov in 1948, demoting him even further, stripping away his remaining authority, reducing him to a series of meaningless administrative positions until Stalin's death in 1953 finally freed him to return to prominence. Viktor Abakumov's fate was equally grim, though it took longer to unfold. His secret records, his private documentation of Zhukov's refusal and Stalin's reaction remained hidden in his quarters for 6 years. He continued his work for Beria, continued his surveillance of military and party officials, continued to record observations that he hoped would someday serve as testimony to what had really happened. But in 1952, during Stalin's final paroxysm of paranoia, Beria himself fell under suspicion. And when Beria fell, his subordinates fell with him. Viktor was arrested in November 1952, charged with participation in a non-existent doctor's plot to assassinate Soviet leaders. During the search of his quarters, NKVD investigators found his hidden records. He was tortured for information about his conspiracy, though there was no conspiracy to reveal. He was told that his records proved that he had been gathering intelligence for foreign powers, though the records contained nothing but observations about internal Soviet politics. He was shown confessions from other arrested doctors and officials, all fabricated, all implicating him in plots that had never existed.
On February 18, 1953, 3 weeks before Stalin's death, Viktor Abakumov was executed. He was 33 years old. His wife was informed that he had been sentenced to 25 years imprisonment and sent to the Far East. She spent the next 5 years writing letters to various camps trying to locate him, never receiving replies because the man she was searching for had been dead since 1953. His hidden records were placed in a sealed file, marked for destruction, but somehow overlooked in the chaos following Stalin's death. They would remain buried in KGB archives until 1991, when a researcher cataloging materials being transferred to the Russian State Archive would discover them and recognize their historical significance. By then, everyone mentioned in the records except Zhukov was dead. But what none of them knew, not Svetlana dying in Lubyanka, not Viktor dying in the same building 3 months before Stalin's death, not Forrester filing his intelligence reports in Moscow, not Zhukov enduring his exile in Odessa, was how these intersecting moments, these small refusals and desperate warnings and careful observations were weaving together into consequences that would shape not just Soviet history, but the entire Cold War. The purge that Svetlana had tried to prevent did come, though not as immediately as she had feared. Between 1946 and 1948, over 3,000 senior Soviet military officers were demoted, transferred to marginal commands, or arrested on fabricated charges. The Red Army, which had been the most effective fighting force in Europe, was systematically gutted of its best commanders, its institutional knowledge, and its professional autonomy. The effect was not immediately visible to Western observers, but it was profound. When war came to Korea in 1950, Soviet military advisors proved far less effective than their World War II performance would have predicted. When the Hungarian uprising occurred in 1956, Soviet military response was clumsy and brutal rather than professionally competent. The pattern would repeat throughout the Cold War. A military establishment that looked powerful on paper, but was crippled by political interference and the systematic removal of competent leadership. And the roots of this dysfunction could be traced directly back to Stalin's 1946 purge, to his determination that no military figure would ever again achieve the popularity and authority that Zhukov had commanded. Zhukov's refusal to enter that war room, his denial of Stalin's theater of humiliation, had forced the purge to take a different form, slower, more surgical, less visible, but ultimately just as destructive. If Svetlana had survived to deliver her warning, if Zhukov had understood the full scope of the fabricated evidence being prepared against him, if he had been able to coordinate with other senior commanders to present a united front, the purge might have been prevented or at least blunted. The Red Army's officer corps might have retained its institutional integrity, its professional culture, its ability to function independently of political terror. But she had died in a basement cell, her warning undelivered, and the machinery of Stalin's paranoia had ground forward with methodical inevitability. The broader catastrophe that all these small failures enabled was not a military disaster in the conventional sense. It was something more insidious, the systematic destruction of the Soviet Union's greatest asset at precisely the moment when the Cold War was beginning. The United States faced a nuclear-armed superpower whose military establishment was being deliberately weakened from within, whose best commanders were being replaced by political loyalists, whose strategic thinking was being subordinated to the whims of a paranoid dictator. The consequences rippled across decades. The Berlin crisis of 1948, where Stalin blockaded West Berlin and Truman responded with the airlift, might have ended differently if competent Soviet military commanders had been advising Stalin instead of terrified yes-men telling him what he wanted to hear. The Korean War, where Soviet pilots flew MiG-15s against American fighters, saw Soviet performance hampered by risk-averse commanders afraid to take initiative because initiative might be interpreted as Bonapartism. The Hungarian uprising of 1956, where Soviet tanks crushed a popular rebellion, was marked by military incompetence that shocked Western observers, units getting lost, commanders unable to coordinate, unnecessary brutality substituting for effective strategy. And through it all, the pattern was the same: political control trumping military effectiveness, fear of purges preventing honest assessment, the long shadow of 1946 hanging over every decision. By the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when Khrushchev, himself a beneficiary of Stalin's purges, having risen through political channels rather than military merit, nearly triggered nuclear war through strategic miscalculation, the rot that Stalin had introduced into Soviet military culture was complete. Professional military judgment had been so thoroughly subordinated to political imperatives that the Soviet leadership could seriously contemplate moving nuclear missiles to Cuba without adequate consideration of American reaction.
The cost was not measured in immediate casualties, though those would come later, in proxy wars fought with Soviet weapons and Soviet advisors. The cost was measured in opportunities lost, in institutional knowledge destroyed, and a generation of Soviet officers who learned that survival required political loyalty rather than military competence, in the gradual erosion of the very military power that Stalin had been so afraid would threaten his rule. And it had all begun, or at least crystallized, in that moment when Zhukov refused to enter Stalin's war room, when Svetlana died trying to deliver a warning that might have changed everything, when Victor recorded observations that would be buried for 40 years, when Forrester filed a report that helped convince American planners they could wait Stalin out. Zhukov survived, though survival came at a cost measured in humiliation and enforced silence. He spent the next 7 years in a series of meaningless appointments, commanding the Odessa military district, then the Urals military district, shuffled from post to post to prevent him from building a power base, stripped of meaningful authority, watching while less competent commanders received promotions that should have been his. He was not allowed to publish his memoirs during Stalin's lifetime. He was not consulted on military matters. He was paraded out for ceremonial occasions when the regime wanted to demonstrate continuity with the war, then returned to obscurity. He lived in a modest Moscow apartment, his phone tapped, his mail read, his few remaining friends afraid to associate with him too openly. Only Stalin's death in March 1953 began his rehabilitation. Khrushchev, engaged in his own power struggle with Beria, needed the support of the military establishment, and Zhukov was the key to securing that support. In 1955, Zhukov was appointed Minister of Defense. In 1956, he helped crush the Hungarian uprising, using methods he might have questioned in 1946, but had learned were necessary for survival. By 1957, he had helped Khrushchev defeat an attempted coup by Stalinist hardliners. But even then, the pattern repeated. In October 1957, Khrushchev, fearing that Zhukov was becoming too powerful, too popular, too independent, had him dismissed from all posts while he was on a state visit to Albania. The accusations were familiar: Bonapartism, self-promotion, attempting to reduce party control over the military. Zhukov was forced into retirement, his second fall from grace, though this time without the threat of execution that had hung over him in 1946. He spent his final years writing his memoirs, finally published in 1969, though heavily censored by Soviet authorities nervous about any account that might question party supremacy. He wrote with careful circumspection about 1946. He described the trophy-looting accusations as unjust charges based on distorted facts. He noted that his removal from command had been politically motivated. He acknowledged that Stalin had been suspicious of military commanders who had gained prominence during the war, but he never mentioned refusing to enter the war room, never detailed the confrontation, never explained the choice that might have saved his life. Whether this was self-censorship, protecting himself even in old age from accusations of insubordination, or whether Soviet censors removed those passages, we cannot know. The original manuscripts were sealed in Soviet archives, released only in fragments after 1991. But the pattern was clear. Even in his own account of his life, Zhukov had to subordinate truth to political necessity, had to maintain the fiction that he had always been loyal, always obedient, always willing to accept party judgment. In private letters written to his daughter in the late 1960s, discovered after her death in 2003 and published in a Russian military history journal, Zhukov was more candid. "I wonder sometimes," he wrote in 1968, "if I should have fought harder in 1946, if I should have rallied the other commanders, should have refused not just to enter that room, but to accept the entire premise of Stalin's purge. But I was tired and afraid, and I told myself that survival was victory enough. Perhaps I was right. I lived, while so many others died. But I also wonder what we might have built if we had found the courage to resist." The letter revealed a man haunted by choices made decades earlier, wondering if his refusal to enter Stalin's war room had been an act of dignity or of cowardice, whether survival through submission had been wisdom or failure. There was no answer, only the weight of years and the knowledge that history had moved forward regardless of his doubts. James Forrester's memoirs, written in 1992 and discovered in his papers after his death, contained a parallel reflection. "I spent 30 years analyzing Soviet military affairs, trying to understand why they never quite lived up to their apparent potential, why their military establishment always seemed hamstrung despite impressive resources and technology. Only after the archives opened did I begin to understand. Stalin had broken something fundamental in 1946 when he went after Zhukov and the other war heroes. He had taught an entire generation of Soviet officers that competence was dangerous, that success invited destruction, that survival required mediocrity. You cannot build an effective military on those foundations, and the Soviet Union spent the next 45 years proving it."
But what strikes me, looking back across nearly 80 years at these intersecting lives and missed connections, is how often history turns on moments of pride and fear rather than grand strategy. Zhukov refused to enter Stalin's war room, and that refusal possibly saved his life while inadvertently demonstrating to Stalin that even humiliation required the victim's participation. Stalin chose exile over execution, never knowing that this choice would leave intact a symbol of military professionalism that would complicate Soviet politics for the next decade. Svetlana Mikhailovna Ivanova sacrificed herself trying to warn a marshal who never knew she existed, dying with intelligence that might have enabled Zhukov to prepare a defense, to coordinate with other commanders, to perhaps prevent or limit the purge. Viktor Abakumov recorded the truth in secret documents that would be buried for 40 years, achieving nothing except to burden his own conscience with the knowledge of his complicity. Dying in the same prison where so many of his victims had died, his careful record surviving him by pure chance. James Forrester observed and reported, his intelligence analysis contributing in small ways to American strategy, never knowing that he had witnessed a turning point in Soviet history, never learning the names of the people whose lives intersected with his observations. And thousands of Soviet officers whose names we will never know were demoted, exiled, arrested, or executed in a purge that achieved Stalin's goal of preventing military Bonapartism while crippling the Soviet Union's military effectiveness for generations. There is a tendency in historical writing to focus on the great decisions, the strategic turning points, the moments when leaders move armies and nations like pieces on a chessboard. We study Stalin's purges as policy, analyze Soviet military doctrine, debate the origins of the Cold War. These are important questions worthy of study and reflection. But wars and ideological struggles are not won or lost only in those grand moments. They are won and lost in 1,000 small decisions, in pride asserted or dignity surrendered, in warnings delivered or dying unheard, in the chance timing of an arrest on the very day a warning was to be delivered, in an American officer's casual conversation with a records clerk, in a decision to make secret copies of surveillance reports that would survive their author by decades. History is made as much by accident and personality as by strategy and resources. And the great leaders who shape events are themselves shaped by their fears, their egos, their capacity for both wisdom and monstrous cruelty. Stalin was brilliant and paranoid, building a superpower while destroying the human capital that made that power meaningful. Zhukov was proud and pragmatic, choosing survival over martyrdom, living long enough to see his life's work dismantled by the system he had served. And the others, Svetlana, Viktor, Forrester, were caught in currents larger than themselves, trying to navigate with incomplete information, making choices whose consequences they could never fully understand. The purge of 1946-1948 cost the Soviet Union far more than the lives of the 3,000 officers who were removed from command. It cost them the institutional culture that had been built during the war, the hard-won lessons of modern combat, the professional ethos that had enabled the Red Army to evolve from the disaster of 1941 to the triumph of 1945. It taught a generation of Soviet officers that political survival trumped military effectiveness, that innovation was dangerous, that the safest course was rigid adherence to doctrine and avoidance of independent thought. The consequences echoed through the Cold War. Soviet military interventions in Hungary in 1956, in Czechoslovakia in 1968, in Afghanistan in 1979 were marked by the same pattern: overwhelming force applied clumsily, political objectives confused with military strategy, commanders afraid to adapt to circumstances for fear of being accused of deviation. The Red Army that had shown such operational brilliance in 1944 to 1945 became increasingly sclerotic, increasingly dependent on mass and firepower rather than skill and flexibility. By the 1980s, when the Soviet Union finally collapsed, its military establishment had become a hollow shell. Impressive on paper, equipped with advanced weapons, but lacking the institutional culture and professional leadership necessary to use those weapons effectively. The war in Afghanistan exposed this reality brutally. A superpower military unable to defeat irregular forces because its commanders had been trained for 40 years to avoid initiative, to follow political guidance rather than military logic, to prioritize survival over success. And the roots of this failure reached back to 1946, to Stalin's determination that no general would ever again achieve Zhukov's prominence, to the systematic destruction of military professionalism in the name of political control. If Svetlana had delivered her warning, if Zhukov had rallied the other commanders, if Viktor's observations had reached people who could have acted on them, if any of a dozen small things had happened differently, the Soviet military might have retained its institutional integrity, and the Cold War might have followed a different course.
I think often about Svetlana Ivanova, dead at 29 in a Lubyanka cell, mourned by only an aunt who never learned her fate, carrying intelligence that might have preserved the military establishment that had saved the Soviet Union from Nazi Germany. I think about her walking toward the Kremlin that June morning, knowing the risk, believing the warning was worth her life, dying before she could deliver it, while Zhukov stood barely 100 meters away, unaware that someone was trying to save him. I think about Viktor Abakumov, dead at 33 in the same building where he had spent years implementing Stalin's terror, his secret record surviving by accident to testify to truths that no one was left alive to confirm, dying with the knowledge that his careful documentation had accomplished nothing except to burden his conscience with the memory of all those he had failed to save. I think about James Forrester, writing intelligence reports that helped shape American Cold War strategy, never knowing the names or fates of the people whose lives intersected with his observations, dying decades later with questions about that young woman he had seen being arrested, questions that would never be answered.
And I think about Zhukov standing outside Stalin's war room, making a decision based on dignity and pride that accidentally saved his life while inadvertently shaping the nature of Stalin's purge, living long enough to see what his choice had cost and wondering in private letters if he should have chosen differently. History has no morals, only consequences, and sometimes our failures produce unexpected results while our most heroic efforts end in silence and anonymity. The threshold of Stalin's war room, where Zhukov refused to enter, becomes, in my mind, a kind of metaphor for all the small gates through which history passes, all the moments when pride or fear or simple human stubbornness redirects the flow of events in ways that no one can predict or control. We remember Zhukov, the marshal who defied Stalin and survived. We build monuments to his victories, study his campaigns in military academies around the world. But we forget Svetlana Mikhailovna Ivanova, shot in a basement and buried in an unmarked grave. We forget Viktor Abakumov, whose secret record survived him by accident. We forget James Forrester's observation that helped shape American strategy. We forget the small refusals and desperate warnings that cascade into consequence. War and ideology reveal human nature in extremis, strip away the comfortable fictions we maintain about ourselves in peaceful times, and what they reveal is this: we are creatures of pride and fear, of loyalty and betrayal, of stubbornness and desperation, even when the fate of nations hangs in the balance. We want history to be about great leaders making great decisions, about wisdom triumphing over tyranny, about courage and sacrifice leading inevitably to justice. But more often, it is about complicated people making impossible choices, some brave, some cowardly, most a mixture of both, choices whose consequences spiral beyond any possibility of prediction or control. Zhukov eventually returned to prominence, of course, after Stalin's death. He served as Minister of Defense, helped secure Khrushchev's power, was purged again when he became too powerful. He lived long enough to write his memoirs, to receive honors, to die in his bed rather than in a basement cell. But the victory was hollow. The military establishment he had tried to build was destroyed. The thousands of competent officers were gone, replaced by political loyalists. The institutional culture that had enabled the Red Army to defeat Nazi Germany was systematically dismantled, and the price was paid not in immediate casualties, but in decades of dysfunction, in proxy wars fought ineffectively, in a military establishment that looked powerful but was fundamentally broken. And the Svetlanas of the world died unknown, their sacrifice unrecorded except in sealed files that would be opened too late to matter. And the victors carried their secrets to graves in potters' fields, their careful documentation discovered by accident decades after anyone cared. And the Forresters observed and analyzed, contributing their small pieces to strategies that would shape the world, never knowing the human stories that lay behind their intelligence reports. And the snow kept falling on the streets of Moscow, patient and indifferent, covering the blood and the fear, and the memory of all those small moments when everything might have been different, when warnings might have been heard, when courage might have overcome fear, when human beings might have risen above their pride and their terror to see clearly what was being lost. The snow fell on the graves of the known and unknown dead, on monuments and unmarked mass graves alike, covering everything in white silence, washing away meaning, leaving only the stubborn facts.